Ataque inminente de Estados Unidos.
Imminent US attack on Venezuela. Yesterday, Tucker Carlson, possibly the journalist with the greatest access to the White House and to President Donald Trump's inner circle, made alarming statements. According to Carlson, the United States would imminently begin a war against Venezuela, and Trump would present the decision in his Christmas speech. Although Trump ultimately made no such announcement in his Christmas address last night, which, incidentally, caused great disappointment among the most prominent figures of the Latin American and Spanish right. The situation in Venezuela still seems extremely tense in light of the possibility of US attacks in the coming hours. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Berlin, Germany, we begin broadcast number 287 of Demolishing Myths Live.
La transmisión número 287 de Demoliendo, mitos en vivo. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos y recuerden, por favor.
Thank you very much for joining us. And please remember to help us with a thumbs up, subscriptions, comments, and the memberships that were recently reactivated after a technical issue with YouTube. And of course, also through our Facebook and PayPal accounts. In this broadcast of Demolishers, we're going to present everything that has happened in the last 24 hours. We'll show the current situation in Venezuela, which is extremely tense, by the way, and we'll analyze the possible scenarios from now on in light of this highly tense situation. Following the announcement by Tucker Carlson, possibly the journalist closest to the White House, as well as other highly reliable sources, regarding an imminent US attack on Venezuela.
Por ende, comenzamos con la información y vamos a presentar
Therefore, we begin with the information, and today we're going to present a lot of it, with many sources and many videos. Finally, we'll present the analysis of the perspectives, the analysis of the scenarios. How does all this begin? Well, like this. Yesterday, live, there was Tucker Carlson's statement. I'm going to show it in small parts due to possible copyright issues. Just yesterday, Joe was accompanying this live broadcast on Judge Napolitano's show. This is what happened. Pay attention.
And then the U.S. ambassador treats him like a king. From now on, Trump is going to start a war in Venezuela. I don't know. I don't know when this show we're on right now airs. Maybe this is live. Well, we're live now, and it'll be published right away afterward. So right now, my impression is that I don't know the answer. I've definitely spent a lot of time on the phone about this. I don't have any power. I'm a podcaster, but I'm very interested. And this is what I know so far, which is the following.
This is what I know so far, which is the following. And from now on, Tucker Carlson's statement. Attention.
Yesterday, members of Congress were informed that a war is approaching and that it will be announced in the address to the nation tonight at 9 by the president. Who knows, by the way, if that will really happen? I don't know.
According to Tucker Carlson's sources, the United States, meaning President Trump, had already decided to start a war against Venezuela. According to Tucker Carlson, in an interview held yesterday morning, or rather at noon European time, during Trump's Christmas speech that evening, the president would make the official declaration of war. Here's a bit more from Tucker Carlson.
And I never want to exaggerate what I know, which is generally quite limited. But a member of Congress told me that this morning. So that's what I know.
My opposition to this, and I'm sure that if you oppose it, they'll say something like, oh, you're a... Well, Tucker Carlson openly rejects the possible invasion of Venezuela, not because he cares about Venezuelans, far from it, but because of the deplorable record of US military interventions abroad. But what matters here is Tucker Carlson's claim, his statement, his prediction. He has insider information, access to senators and to the inner circle of the White House, Trump's inner circle. Yesterday, Trump gave his Christmas speech with his usual bluster, but he made no reference to Venezuela, no announcements about the Venezuelan issue. That was barely mentioned by Trump yesterday, in his usual combative and boastful tone. Our nation is strong. America, the United States, is now respected.
Our country is back, stronger than ever before.
Nuestro país está de vuelta, más fuerte.
Our country is back, stronger than ever.
Of which the world has never seen. Soon we
Estamos viviendo
We are experiencing an economic resurgence, the greatest ever seen in history. Soon we will host the Olympic Games and the World Cup. Both were secured by me.
Ambos fueron conseguidos por mí. También mentira esto, pero bueno.
most importantly we will celebrate.
That's not true either, but anyway. And besides, we'll be celebrating the Declaration of Independence, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence.
The comeback of America that began just
Y no podríamos hacerlo de mejor manera que completando este retorno.
And we couldn't do it in a better way than by completing this return of the United States to the top of the world. Typical Trump, but nothing about Venezuela. Many figures from the right-wing media in Latin America and Spain are sad, somehow disappointed by this. The same goes for Spanish-speaking political figures, both in Latin America and in Spain. However, beyond that, tensions are sky-high due to the change. The shift seen in Trump's policy toward Venezuela over the past 48 hours. A shift in which his government not only gathers troops around Venezuela and attacks boats supposedly belonging to Venezuelan drug traffickers, also supposedly Venezuelan, since so far only the identities of Colombian and Trinidad and Tobago fishermen have been confirmed as victims of these attacks, with more than 80 dead already.
Pero no solo eso, sino que ahora efectivamente comienza.
But not only that, now a real shift is beginning. Following first some statements and then a post by Trump, the attacks start on the tankers of the Venezuelan or Iranian Ghost Fleet, along with the pursuit of Venezuelan oil, according to Trump's own words. At this point, the shift is no longer about the pretext of fighting drug trafficking, but rather about the direct seizure of an apparently Iranian tanker off the Venezuelan coast, and even the narrative, straight from Trump himself, about the need to reclaim American oil in Venezuela. Those were Trump's exact words yesterday.
Attention. Well, this here reminds us that they took away all our energy rights.
all of our energy rights. They took all of our oil.
Nos quitaron todo nuestro petróleo no hace mucho tiempo.
They took all our oil not long ago. In Trump's post on his social network Truth, he not only emphasized the alleged theft of supposedly American oil in Venezuela, but also the theft of land. After that post, he didn't make further statements about it, but he kept repeating in various interviews this idea of the theft of American oil in Venezuela, which at first raised a lot of doubts. Because what theft of American oil in Venezuela, if the oil is in Venezuelan territory and subsoil? And in fact, the history of the United States in Venezuela is generally characterized by the opposite, by the theft of Venezuelan resources.
Por el robo de los recursos venezolanos. Y si generalizamos un poquito más,
and if we generalize a little more, the theft of Latin America's resources by the United States, and never the other way around. Here we have Trump again with the same line. They stole our oil. We had a lot of oil. As you know, we had a huge amount of oil in that area. They expelled our companies, and we want it back. Well, we were finally able to determine, based on statements from one of Trump's aides, one of his advisors, what oil they are presenting here as stolen, or what fantasy they are publicly promoting. Apparently, they are referring to the so-called law of nationalization of hydrocarbons, carried out by President Chavez. So-called nationalization, because even in the darkest neoliberal night in Venezuela, in the 1990s, the country never actually privatized its oil.
Una privatización de su petróleo de forma oficial, de manera formal, a diferencia de...
Officially, unlike almost all other Latin American countries, with the exception of Uruguay, Mexico, and a few others, Venezuela did not privatize its oil. Within the framework of the prevailing neoliberalism of the 1990s, the same as now, all the state-owned oil companies in the region, for next to nothing, handed over, sold or undersold their companies and oil resources. Yes, in Argentina, Ecuador, Bolivia, and so on. Therefore, starting in the 2000s, popular governments, with Chavez at the forefront, began a process of reclaiming that oil through renationalization or re-state ownership laws, which incidentally did not create purely state-owned companies, but rather joint ventures with the already existing private firms.
Sino empresas mixtas con las empresas privadas ya existentes. En Venezuela no, esta ley de Chávez no generó la restatización.
Not in Venezuela. Chavez's law did not lead to renationalization because there had never been a privatization law for the state oil company, PDVSA. However, through other mechanisms, such as dubious concessions and the appointment of managers connected to the interests of US oil multinationals within state companies, they gained access, power, and control over Venezuelan oil without the need to privatize PDVSA. That is why this clarification is necessary regarding the so-called, by many analysts unfamiliar with the situation, renationalization law of Chavez. So what did Chavez's law actually bring about? A change in the management and real control of Venezuela's oil assets. If before that law oil extraction generated 10% of the income for Venezuelans and 90% for foreign oil companies, from that law onward, and with the expulsion of managers tied to international interests, the review of concessions, and the establishment of a mixed oil exploitation system, with 60% for PDVSA, the state-owned oil company, effectively reclaimed by Chavez's government, and 40% for foreign companies. That law brought about a change in the distribution of oil profits of petroleum resources, after which the oil companies began to receive approximately 30% of the profits or income.
Para las petroleras o de los ingresos, generaban una distribución de un 30% de los ingresos.
They established a distribution of 30% of the revenue for the oil companies and 70% for Venezuelans, for the Venezuelan state. That was the reversal of the previous proportions, 10% for Venezuela and 90% for the multinational oil companies, not only American ones. I also remember the Brazilian Petrobras and the Spanish Repsol being involved in the business. Well, under Chavez this was changed, logically in favor of Venezuelan interests, to 30 for the oil companies, by the way, quite a generous share, and 70 for the Venezuelans. And this moreover came with compensation paid by Chavez to all these companies as a result of this contractual change.
Como consecuencia de este cambio contractual. Esta supuestamente la situación de
This supposedly reported situation by Trump, this alleged theft of American oil in Venezuela, is pure delusion. Also, another thing, by the way, these companies used to take the lion's share, they used to steal the lion's share, and starting with Chavez and this law, they only got 30%, which was still quite a good cut for them. How many of them left Venezuela after this change implemented by Chavez? None. Zero. Why? Because even with that 30%, of course, their profits dropped from 90 to 30. But even that 30% still represented a profitable business for all these multinational oil companies. That's why they didn't leave Venezuela.
Por eso no abandonaron Venezuela. Abandonaron Venezuela las empresas estadounidenses, algunas después.
US companies left Venezuela, some later on, following the situation that began under Obama with the sanctions and so on. But this is Trump's accusation, and logically, this shift in rhetoric, no longer about drug boats, the Aragua train, or Aunt Maruca, any nonsense, but directly the message of, we want Venezuelan oil. And it started with the seizure of an oil tanker carrying Venezuelan oil off the coast of Venezuela. So, even though yesterday's speech did not include a declaration of war, it created, and continues to create, a great deal of tension.
Este cambio generó y genera muchísima tensión. Tanto que inmediatamente comenzaron.
So much so that immediately, many world leaders, at least all those who are in some way connected to Venezuela, began to state their positions, began to react. Among the first was the President of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum. The correct pronunciation is Sheinbaum, but well, we'll call her Scheinbaum, as they do in Mexico. Here, it wasn't even in response to a journalist's question at the press conference, but on her own initiative. She directly began with this statement, which I find very valuable, from Claudia Scheinbaum.
Attention. In light of President Trump's statement yesterday and the situation in Venezuela, we reaffirm Mexico's position in accordance with the Constitution of non-intervention, no foreign interference, self-determination of peoples, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. We call for dialogue and peace, not intervention, in the face of any international controversy. This is our position by conviction and by Constitution. This must always be the position of any president of Mexico.
Bueno, muy valiosa esta intervención de
Well, this intervention by Claudia Scheinbaum was very valuable. Many reject her for her supposedly moderate positions. For me, she's really the best possible president for Mexico, no doubt with some contradictions, but considering the presidential candidates, by far the best. And here, very courageously, she clearly and publicly, truly explicitly stated Mexico's position in this situation, openly opposing Trump's stance. And she's a bit reminiscent of AMLO in her style, using very substantial, powerful words, yet always in a very calm manner.
Con mucha fuerza, pero siempre de forma muy tranquila. Y esto con relación a Trump y a sus...
And this, in relation to Trump and his bluster, this makes Trump, as often happens with irritable, megalomaniac people, feel somewhat uncomfortable when instead of responding to someone's shouting with more shouting or with fear, one answers with great composure, centered, calm, yet firm. That unsettles Trump. It really does, right? So, very well done, Mexican President Claudia Scheinbaum. But she wasn't the only one who reacted to this extremely tense situation, which shows just how tense things are. All the world's leaders are responding, reacting in one way or another. And here, for example, we have Lula's own position, also very important, in the RT report. We'll show it here.
El reporte de RT. Lo presentamos por aquí.
In the region, voices were heard calling for an end to Washington's escalation. The president of Brazil, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, is appealing to diplomacy to peacefully resolve the tensions between Venezuela and the United States. He is also offering to act as a mediator. It was possible to negotiate without war, and I have always expressed my concern about what lies behind this, because it cannot simply be about the issue of Maduro's removal. There are other interests, and we know what they are. There is no reason to use weapons. It is important to resolve differences at the negotiating table. Diplomacy produces far greater results. And I am available to both Venezuela and the United States in order to contribute to a peaceful solution on our continent.
Bien, esta la posición de Lula.
Well, this is Lula's position, also extremely important, because it helps shape the scenario for a possible US intervention. The more rejections there are, and the more active Venezuela's Latin American defense policy becomes, the higher the cost of an intervention for Trump. That's why it's essential for the two major Latin American powers, Mexico and Brazil, to reject this. More reactions and, once again, more signs of a situation of extreme tension. Lavrov himself, from Russia, responded to this situation as follows.
Respondía a esta situación lo siguiente.
The behavior of the United States, including its activities in the Caribbean Sea, are actions that, of course, cause displeasure in almost every country except the European ones, which have stopped and remained silent. But all the other countries, of course, have already expressed their position. We are very concerned about the activity of the U.S. naval forces. In general, the Pentagon's military statements about the fact that, in addition to the illegal acts of intervention in civil affairs and the operations in the Caribbean Sea, they also plan a land operation. All of this, of course, creates tension, while also a rejection from Lavrov in Russia.
De Lavrov desde Rusia, clarísimo. También por ahí las declaraciones de la vocera.
Very clear. Also, there are the statements from the Kremlin's spokesperson. We're not going to show them because they basically follow Lavrov's own line. Petro is also important, very important. And in this sense, so far he has maintained a clear stance rejecting the invasion. Many often criticize him for his inconsistencies and contradictions. According to the criticisms on many issues, once again, for me, just like Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, Petro represents the best possible president for Colombia. That doesn't absolve him of many contradictions and many questionable actions, but comparatively, with respect to everyone else and to Colombia's past, he still stands out by far as the best possible president. Which of course doesn't mean we shouldn't criticize him when he makes wrong, mistaken, or even malicious decisions. By the way, here's Petro, yesterday also responding harshly.
Respondiendo también duramente. Atención.
Attention. Texas is an invaded territory. It wasn't sold, it was invaded, just like California and the entire southern United States. And yet, a Latin American president can't say, give it back, they stole it from us. But he can say about Venezuelan oil, give it back because they stole it from me. How's that? Well, I say, let's make a pact and have them return what they took from us, and whatever they think we took from them, which we didn't take at all, let's put it on the negotiation table, through dialogue and on equal terms, not with missiles over the poor. Most of the people killed by those missiles are Colombians. And so far we've found one. And we're uncovering some bodies in northern La Guajira that are, we'll see where they're from. They could be Venezuelan.
Vamos a ver de dónde pueden ser venezolanos. Por las corrientes y el estudio que hemos hecho de las corrientes porque
Because of the currents, the study we did on the currents, because they reached the port of Lopez in northern La Guajira, right? Petro's words are clear, with this beautiful expression from Colombian Spanish. How come? How come, indeed? How come? Texas stolen, California stolen, so many things stolen by the United States, and now accusing the rest of the world of being thieves. Very clear from Petro in this regard. Also naturally there was a response from Venezuela. The first one was Mr. Diosdado Cabello here on his show, a classic of Venezuelan television, Con el Mazo Dando, a program from the Chavez era, right? Here are his words from yesterday about
Aquí sus palabras el día de ayer sobre Trump.
la amenaza real.
The real, undeniable threat of a decaying imperialism. 43 years. But truly this is outrageous. This is outrageous that Venezuela is stealing land from the United States, that Venezuela is stealing oil from the United States, that Venezuela is stealing other assets from the United States. For God's sake, review history, Mr. President. Review history. All I can tell you is that New York and Washington, yes, New York and Washington, are paved with stolen Venezuelan asphalt. Stolen.
without paying a single cent.
A Venezuelan.
Bueno, este Diosdado, duro, interesante, el dato
Well, this Diosdado, tough, interesting, the historical fact about Venezuelan asphalt in Washington and New York. And here Maduro too, in a sort of confession about the current situation in Venezuela of extremely high tension, is going to make a direct appeal to the Colombian people and the Colombian armed forces to stand with Venezuela in its defense, or to accompany Venezuela in its defense in
de Venezuela o campañan a Venezuela en su defensa en el eventual caso de una...
In the possible event of an invasion, here is Maduro, today's Maduro, not yesterday's, today's. Divide and conquer. And how much they have done to divide us, Colombia, from Venezuela every single day. The greatest guarantee we have of peace, stability, and respect in the world is unity. That is why today, 200 years after the approval of the fundamental law that founded Greater Colombia, 206 years after this great idea was born, this great nation that declared itself a republic in arms and gave full freedom to South America, I make my call, reaffirmed with the deep love I feel as a proud Colombian, to the ordinary people of Colombia, to its social movements, to its political forces, to the Colombian military whom I know very well. I call on them for perfect unity with Venezuela so that no one dares to touch the sovereignty of our countries, and so that we may fulfill Bolivar's mandate of permanent union and shared happiness.
Y de felicidad compartida.
Bien, ahí la referencia a la Gran Colombia.
Well, the reference to Gran Colombia refers to the name of the republic created by Bolivar when the South American revolutionary movement began in Caracas. Meanwhile, in parallel, it began in Buenos Aires with the May Revolution, and from top to bottom with Bolivar, and from bottom to top with San Martin, they determined the liberation of Latin Americans. This is the situation in Venezuela. These are the reactions abroad, so to speak, the reactions outside the United States to Trump's words. However, the tension is also present within the United States itself.
Está presente en los propios Estados Unidos. La situación de tensión respecto a esta.
The tension surrounding these statements, this shift in Trump's narrative, and the entire situation is also reflected in US politics. For that reason, yesterday the Senate voted on a bill introduced to block any potential military action by the US government against Venezuela. In fact, the US Constitution states that presidents cannot start wars without the corroboration, without the confirmation of Parliament. But through subterfuges, US presidents start wars anyway, without Congress's approval, which practically never takes part in validating a military decision made by the president. Why? In what way?
Militar de su presidente. ¿Por qué? ¿De qué manera? Bueno, básicamente comienzan acciones militares sin una
Well,
declaración formal.
basically, they begin military actions without a formal declaration of war, and eventually, when they issue a declaration of war sometime later, Congress already seems aligned with the White House. The legislative already seems aligned with the executive. Well, some US senators, both Democrats and Republicans, wanted to create a special law to prevent Trump from launching an attack on Venezuela. And these, for example, were the discussions that took place during yesterday's debate, before the vote. We're now going to present the result of that bill, or that parliamentary session. These are the words of one of the sponsors of this bill, the conservative Republican Senator Thomas Massie, speaking about this situation. And pay attention to this, because US domestic politics will determine Trump's actions much more than any other statement or position from foreign countries, or even from foreign powers.
Países extranjeros, incluso de potencias extranjeras. Esto lo dicho allí ayer en el Senado.
I said this yesterday in the Senate. And it's not only very interesting because of the situation surrounding the vote on this bill, but also because of the perspective expressed on Trump's plans by a Republican himself, someone connected to sectors of the MAGA movement, the Trump movement.
Del movimiento MAGA, del movimiento de Trump. Atención.
Truth. To the extent that war-making power devolves to one person, liberty dissolves.
When the
power to declare war is concentrated in a single person, the president, freedom.
Una sola persona, el presidente, la libertad se disuelve, desaparece.
If the president believes
It dissolves, it disappears.
should make the case and Congress should vote.
Si el presidente Trump cree que es necesaria una
If
guerra
President Trump believes that a war against Venezuela or a military intervention in Venezuela is necessary, then he should come before Congress, present his arguments, and Congress should vote before American lives and money are consumed in a regime change operation in Venezuela. Remember that in the United States and in the English-speaking world, they call coups d'etat, or coup operations, regime change. They use a euphemism, a more elegant term, regime change operation.
Elegante, operación de cambio de régimen. Un poquito más.
Let's be honest about likely outcomes. Do we
A little more.
Maduro will be replaced by a modern-day George Washington?
Seamos sinceros y hablemos de lo que sucedería y de cuáles serían las
Let's be honest and talk about what would happen and what the consequences for the United States would be from such madness. Do we really believe that if Maduro were overthrown, he would be replaced by someone like Washington in modern times? Washington, the former president, one of the founding fathers of the United States, right? How has that idea of overthrowing governments in hopes of getting better ones worked out so far in Cuba, Libya, Iraq, Syria? Previous presidents told us we had to go to war over weapons of mass destruction.
Mass destruction that did not exist. Now,
Armas de destrucción.
Weapons of mass destruction that, by the way, did not exist.
if it were a
Ahora nos están.
Now they're giving us the same speech, using the same script, only this time they say that weapons of mass destruction are drugs. By the way, remember Trump's statement a few days ago about fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction?
about drugs, we
A delusion too.
Mexico or China or Colombia.
Si queremos combatir las drogas, ¿por qué no bombardeamos?
If we want to fight drugs, why don't we bomb Mexico, China, or Colombia? And if we want to fight drugs, then why does the president grant a presidential pardon, to the drug trafficker Orlando Hernandez? By the way, not long ago, a Latin American drug trafficker was pardoned by Trump himself due to his political connections with the Republican right. This isn't about drugs, it's about regime change and oil. Well, there's also the internal situation in US politics, which is very tense on this issue. The vote, in the end, by a very small margin, resulted in the rejection of this law against blocking a Venezuelan attack. But even so, it created a political event.
Pero generó, a pesar de eso, un hecho político. El día de ayer, además de esta...
Yesterday, in addition to that vote, we also witnessed in the US Congress the final approval vote for the military budget. This is ultimately tied to the ratification of a defense budget of around $900 billion for a single year. By far, the largest military budget in the world. By far, far, far. And moreover, this budget still includes funds for Ukraine. So be careful with this internal situation, because it is also shaping Trump's final decision. On one hand, there is pressure from many countries and from US congressmen of both parties against this intervention.
De ambos partidos en contra de esta intervención. Por otro lado, la presión permanente de la...
On the other hand, there's the constant pressure from the military-industrial complex's policy of endless wars, approving a new budget with more money for Ukraine next year, despite Trump's supposed stance of pulling back on that. And be careful too, because new images and new revelations are emerging about a very, very, very important and sensitive issue for Trump himself. The matter of Jeffrey Epstein's island, the photos, the images, and the evidence of the connections of many people with Jeffrey Epstein, including Trump himself.
Jeffrey Epstein e incluso del propio Trump. Aquí, por ejemplo, y esto también está generando...
Here, for example, and this is also negatively affecting Trump's final decision, the rejection by part of the US Congress obviously creates pressure against the invasion. The approval of the military budget and the need for permanent wars, that logically drives the invasion. And the Epstein issue, unfortunately, could also fuel a possible decision by Trump in favor of an invasion. Why? Because many times, and this could also be the case, in the United States, we might once again be witnessing a situation in which an American president starts a war as a smokescreen in the face of a crisis or a troubling situation caused by allegations.
De crisis o una situación preocupante debido a las denuncias. Por ejemplo, recuerden a Bill Clinton, las denuncias.
For example, remember Bill Clinton and the accusations about his sexual affairs with Monica Lewinsky in the White House. Monica Lewinsky, an intern, a White House aide, with whom good old Bill began to establish intimate carnal relations. And since this was causing a lot of problems, what did good old Bill decide to do? The bombing of the former Yugoslavia as a smokescreen, and quite successfully. The same goes for George W. Bush, Bush the son, Bush Jr., and his terrible performance up until the attack on the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center, and the war in Iraq.
Gemelas contra el World Trade Center y la guerra en Irak. Esa guerra en Irak determinó que todos los problemas económicos.
That war in Iraq made all the economic problems and the disaster of his administration disappear from the media, vanish from the center of public opinion, and in their place appeared the unified national support of all Americans for the government in its fight against the weapons of mass destruction of the tyrannical Saddam Hussein. So the Epstein issue could also lead Trump to make a decision in the direction of an invasion, simply as a form of escape. And here come the new revelations. Here, even written on the body of one of the young girls on the island, things, well, about... Well, that Epstein there on the left, I can't really tell who the person on the left is, although he looks a lot like Noam Chomsky, but it's surely someone else.
Parecido a Noam Chomsky, pero seguramente otra persona. Difícilmente Noam Chomsky ahí. Acá el bueno de Bill Gates con una...
It's hardly Noam Chomsky there. Here's good old Bill Gates with an unknown woman, possibly one of the victims. Here, 3 girls all around. These posts keep showing more and more girls, always young and beautiful, with their faces covered, all victims. Here's a surprise from the other day with, on one side, Jeffrey Epstein on the right, really living like a king. Pay attention to his armchair, the paintings, almost like in a palace, in a royal residence. And on the other side, the, oh dear God, former advisor to Donald Trump, and one of the most important figures of the alt-right, the alternative right, the new far right, whose name I can't recall right now. There's another one.
Cuyo nombre no puedo ahora recordar, ahí otra, también algunas fotos de Trump en estas nuevas imágenes.
Also, some photos of Trump appear in these new images. There's Woody Allen on the right, and Ehud Barak, a former Israeli prime minister, and more people. Steve Bannon, thank you very much from Red Consultora. There's Steve Bannon. Well, these images published by the Democrats, now the second batch of releases, are also implicating this man. I have no idea who he is, but obviously, well, that can be found out later, are causing a lot of damage, not only to the government, but above all, to his voter base. Remember Trump's promise to release all the Epstein files, and even the statement from his Attorney General, Pam Bondi. Here in my hand, I have a book with all the images and all the complaints from the Epstein case. We're going to publish it.
Del caso Epstein lo vamos a publicar y después determinaron la...
And then, they decided not to publish it, to keep those images from appearing because of the large number of people involved and the prominent figures implicated, possibly including Donald Trump himself. And this leads to a decline in Donald Trump's public image, and consequently, creates pressure in favor of war, unfortunately. So this is the situation of back and forth moves, of pressures and counter-pressures. As for the possible scenarios, and here we can begin a more proper analysis, Venezuela, beyond these statements, has so far been responding above all through military deterrence.
A través de la disuasión militar, ¿sí? Por eso presentan permanentemente.
That's why Venezuelans, and rightly so, without a doubt, constantly show operations and images of their armed forces. The different commanders of the Bolivarian armed forces carry out operations, exercises, speeches, and statements, reminding everyone of the strength of the Venezuelan armed forces, showing their muscle. And among other things, here are also some images of, well, of the Venezuelan Navy, at least some of them. Others, obviously, are not. This is a video broadcast on Venezuelan channels. But that's actually a US aircraft carrier, right? And those are F-18 jets, by the way. That's from the United States.
Aviones F-18, por cierto. Eso de Estados Unidos. Bien, hay también
well, there's also a Virginia-class submarine, obviously. So far, the Venezuelans are responding that way, right? Through deterrence. These are our cards. If you attack us, we'll respond with all of this. Right? You won't be able to bring down Maduro for free. All of this will come at a huge cost to you. This has been Venezuela's response so far. Even in the last few hours, statements have appeared from both Maduro and other high-ranking Venezuelan officials about the start of military escorts for oil tankers.
Militares a los buques petroleros. Sí, según Maduro, van a aparecer escoltas.
Yes. According to Maduro, military escorts will appear accompanying the oil tankers sanctioned by the United States and incidentally subjected to this blockade imposed by that country. Now then, and be careful with this, and this may be the first piece of advice for Nicolás for President Maduro, be careful not to respond to provocations. Be careful not to react to provocations, because to a large extent, the neoconservative hawks promoting this invasion are precisely seeking a Venezuelan reaction to generate a casus belli, to somehow create an excuse, a cause for a larger attack, for a full-scale intervention.
a toda máquina. Entonces, acompañar a los buques.
So, escorting the ships militarily, correct. Showing military strength, correct. Military deterrence, also correct. But, if Venezuela could do all this, or at least the military escorts for the oil tankers, without the direct participation of the Venezuelan armed forces, that would be much better. And how could Venezuela do this? But Ezequiel, how could Venezuela provide military escorts for its oil tankers without its own armed forces? Ping, little light bulb. Does it remind you of something called Wagner? The Wagner Group and other Russian military companies are already involved in protecting the so-called Russian Ghost Fleet. Basically, ships that are not insured by British insurers as a result of the sanctions illegally imposed by the United States and Europe.
Británicas a raíz de las sanciones impuestas ilegalmente por Estados Unidos y por Europa. Sin validez internacional las sanciones y con otras aseguradoras.
The sanctions have no international validity, and there are other insurers, but on many of these ships the presence of the musicians, as they are called, Wagner, has already begun to appear. And if not, here is proof. Information from the media. Pay attention to this. From Swedish media, no less, if I remember correctly, from Swedish public television, reporting the following. Pay attention to the place, to the source of information. We, looking into Swedish media, written in Swedish, thanks to the browser's translation, can determine this. An investigation by Swedish public television reported, based on inquiries supposedly carried out by the Swedish Navy, by the Swedish Armed Forces, the following.
Por la Marina Sueca, por la Armada Sueca, lo siguiente. Armada. Rusia protege.
The Russian Navy is protecting the Shadow Fleet with a military operation. For some time now, Russia has been carrying out an operation in the Baltic Sea that is believed to aim at safeguarding the country's parallel fleet. According to the Swedish Navy, the Russian effort is evident through warships and aircraft guarding specific areas in the Baltic Sea, as well as uniformed personnel aboard the tanker Sombra. There's no reason to be alarmed about any of this, but we want to inform you about what's happening at sea, says the Navy's Chief of Operations, Marko Pektovic.
And here, the full report.
Är en viktig del för Ryssland att hålla igång sin ekonomi och för Ryssland att kunna fortsätta sin...
We're going to present the translation here. The browser itself was generating it, which is why there was that flicker. Anyway, here are the images from the Swedish Navy reporting the presence of military personnel on board the ships. People dressed like soldiers, but without the Russian flag, instead wearing another insignia, that of the Wagner Group and other PMCs, as they call private military companies. So, what better idea than having armed Wagner personnel aboard Venezuelan or Iranian oil tankers? And if suddenly a Black Hawk helicopter, like the other day, tries to land with 10 Marines to illegally seize a ship, an open act of piracy, those who start firing at that helicopter shouldn't appear dressed as Venezuelan soldiers, but as Wagner mercenaries. Who will they blame for it? Venezuela. Why? Because of a mercenary. And to top it off, a mercenary from a Russian company. So be careful with this tactic. Cunning, my Venezuelan friends and brothers, cunning. Don't react foolishly to provocations, but respond with more cunning than they do. The skin of a lamb and inside the fox. And in this case, the Wagner Fox, one of the possibilities.
Una de las posibilidades. Por otro lado,
on the other hand, remember also that generally speaking, the population, the American electorate, rejects this military intervention. And above all, the MAGA supporters, the MAGA voters, Donald Trump's movement, largely reject it as well because of Trump's campaign promise to end the senseless wars that have brought enormous costs to the United States and very few gains. Here, for example, I want to show, yes, just a second, what a pity, I had this prepared. An image, this prepared here. One moment, folks. Now yes, this is Donald Trump's approval rating chart. Oh, it's so small. Well, I'll show it anyway, despite the poor quality. There.
Así. Quizás algo ahí más o menos visible.
Maybe something there is more or less visible, well, almost illegible. Here, at the beginning, very low disapproval. Here, approval. At this point, the lines are reversed. And sorry for the poor quality of this. It's a very strange file type. J5. Well, at this moment, Trump has a positive image of 42% and a negative image of 54%, and it's growing. So if Venezuela capitalizes on this situation intelligently, if it makes smart use of it, presenting this invasion to the US electorate, and above all to Trump's electorate, as an unpopular measure then, out of fear that Trump's negative image might worsen even more, he will back down, because this will, electorally, take a toll on the results of next year's midterm elections. So, along those lines, necessarily, there's also a course of action for Venezuelans, for the government of Venezuela, establishing a discourse, a narrative, about the costs of this war for the United States and how bad this war is, how unpopular it is, Trump's broken promises, and from there, the drop in Trump's poll numbers, and therefore a setback. That's why Trump should have to correct his stance on this, as the ultimate proof of the internal tensions in the United States, and of where, once again, and sorry for hammering this point to exhaustion, but this is the smart way for Venezuela to respond to this threat, on one hand with military strength, and on the other with geopolitical cunning. What other forms of action does Venezuela have? Well, through contacts with US politicians who oppose the war against Venezuela, and as a sign of the disputes and the current boiling point of the tremendous tension in the United States, there is debate in the White House about this, for or against. Here, leaked images of one of the main promoters of the war, none other than Marco Rubio himself, caught red-handed through one of the Oval Office windows, obviously with a very powerful telephoto lens, looking very nervous, pacing back and forth. Here's another leaked image, Marco Rubio, very, very nervous in the Oval Office, clearly arguing about this.
Evidentemente discutiendo respecto a esto. Él, una de las voces a favor, sin dudas.
He is undoubtedly one of the voices in favor. But on the other side, for example, there's Tulsi Gabbard, who opposes this intervention. I also remember Kennedy himself, who was against it. Perhaps some contact with J.D. Vance, the vice president, might be possible. This is extremely, extremely important. And beyond the political pressure on political figures, Venezuela, the Maduro government, should immediately begin reaching out to the media figures of the MAGA movement, especially Tucker Carlson, who is currently the strongest critic of the invasion of Venezuela in the United States. They should invite him for an exclusive interview in Caracas with Maduro, in which Maduro would express Venezuela's willingness to maintain a good relationship with the United States, even the possibility of resuming oil shipments to the US in exchange for a peace agreement between the countries.
Un acuerdo de paz entre los países. Debería además Maduro recordar cosas muy...
Maduro should also recall things that sound very pleasing to the ears of Tucker Carlson and Trump's voters, such as the ban on abortion in Venezuela, something Tucker Carlson himself has mentioned in his shows as a positive thing. He, being a conservative, rejects abortion. Venezuela lacks a law allowing legal abortion. That's why Maduro should present this as a unifying element. The same goes for the absence of laws regarding gender transition in Venezuela, one of Tucker Carlson's and the MAGA movement's obsessions. All these things, right? Shared by both the Venezuelan government and conservative positions in US politics, should be presented as a form of rapprochement, so that Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and other media figures keep hammering away in the United States against the war, striking at Trump's most sensitive point, his own voters. And finally, here's the last piece of advice for Nicolás President Maduro. They should also create, in this negotiation, an elegant way out for Trump. Trump, in this situation, because of his own bravado, foolishness, militarism, ignorance, volatility, or whatever you want to call it, by sending more and more military resources, ships, planes, and soldiers to the vicinity of Venezuela, is already setting a trap for himself, a situation in which he cannot simply back down after such a massive mobilization. Without some kind of result, he can sell to the American public, and above all, to his electorate.
A la ciudadanía estadounidense y por sobre todas las cosas a su electorado. Entonces, deberían también los venezolanos presentar.
Then, Venezuelans should also present an elegant exit offer for Trump, so he can backtrack by saying, thanks to my mobilization of resources, I was able to restore oil exploitation by US companies in Venezuela. Something that, by the way, would be beneficial for Venezuela if those companies participate by investing within the legal framework established by the Venezuelan constitution and its laws. The exploitation of Venezuelan oil, in that sense, would be something positive. Well, yes, Trump, you won. You won a lot of things.
Ganaste un montón de cosas. Por tu fuerza y tu músculo retrocedió Venezuela.
Because of your strength and muscle, Venezuela backed down, and now you can quietly back off with your aircraft carriers and planes and go back home, United States, with Trump celebrating this false and deceitful victory. Just like in Ukraine, the Russians are creating that diplomatic and elegant exit for Trump, so that Trump can retreat without appearing as the loser of the war. The same thing here in Venezuela. Demolishers, before we finish, I want to remind you, of course, that in 40 minutes, Adrián Zelaya's show will begin on our sister channel, MP Geopolitics.
Adrián Zelaya en nuestro canal hermano de MP Geopolítica. Más o menos nosotros en 1000 seguidores, 1000 demoledores.
More or less, we're at 1,000 followers, 1,000 supporters, and 583 likes. Please, those who haven't yet given us a like, help us that way. Toward the end, and after all this analysis, I wanted to present the situation in Yakutia regarding the cold, by the way, as the closing of this broadcast. Here, sometimes, during the extremely cold Berlin winters, I grumble about temperatures of 20 degrees below zero. When the temperature drops below zero, for me, the cold becomes unbearable.
Por debajo de cero para mí comienza un frío insoportable. Aquí puede descender hasta menos 20.
Here, it can drop to minus 20. Well, in Yakutia, in Russian Siberia, pay attention to the situation. 3 days ago, in December, it was 45 degrees below zero, and that's normal. There's no bad weather, only bad clothing, this lady says. Here, people can't park their cars overnight with the engine off, because once it's turned off, the engine freezes immediately at this temperature. So the car stays running all night. That's also why there's smog, the smoke. And the funny part, look at how they sell fish, which is obviously very popular there. Who needs a refrigerator? Who needs a freezer, right? When the temperature itself is like a deep freezer, minus 45 degrees Celsius. There's someone drinking tea or something with hot water.
Mamita querida, menos 45. Bueno. De acá la fuerza de los rusos también y de los...
Dear little mama, minus 45. That's where the strength of the Russians and the Yakuts comes from too, right? That's why they're such fierce warriors. How unpleasant. As for me, please, sunshine, nice temperature, sea, beach. How lovely summer is. Demolishers, tomorrow we'll be here, as every Friday with Juan Antonio Aguilar. Tomorrow's talk will surely be very interesting. On Saturday, once again demolishing myths live with our analysis, and on Sunday again with Fernando Moragon. Demolishers, join us with a like against censorship, and as always, thank you for being with us. To Beatriz Pulido, our moderator, as always, a big kiss, eternal thanks to her as well, and see you tomorrow. Bye.
Y hasta el día de mañana. Chao.